Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian file, coming to you live on All 24 News with me, Karim Fazakari. We're now past 2 weeks since Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine, and there remains hope that the Russian advance can be stalled long enough for sanctions to so badly damage the Russia's economy that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be forced, one way or another, to end his operation. But an analysis of what's happening doesn't favor such hope. We will be discussing this and more with our panel of guests via Skype. We have Julia Rockenthod, Assistant Professor at FEAR from Malaysia. Thank you for joining us, Julia. And from France, we have Abdenour Toumi, journalist and Maghreb studies expert at Orsam. Abdenour, thank you for joining us. So the talk begins right after this break. Welcome again, dear viewers and honored guests, and thank you for joining our channel. Before we delve into discussion, let's begin with some live updates regarding the Russian military operation in Ukraine. Fighting is raging in northwest of Kiev, with the bulk of Russian ground forces 25 kilometers from the center of the Ukrainian capital. Russia's bombardment of Ukraine widens, with raids reported on east-central city of Dnipro and airfields in western Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk. Ukrainian officials say Russian shelling again prevented evacuations from Mariupol, where conditions are critical. United States and its top allies are revoking Russia's most favored nation status amid pressure campaign on President Vladimir Putin to end the war. Ukrainian envoy to United Nations dismisses Moscow's accusation that Kiev is operating US-backed biological weapons laboratories as insane delirium. I start with you, Julia. Any comments regarding these updates on the 12th day of Russia's military operation? How did we get here? What does Russia want?
Well, it's a very complex question about what Russia wants and what's the end game, even though Russian government has officially stated what its priorities were about the security guarantees and thus the nature of the ongoing war that we are having. What concerns the biological weapons issue, it surfaced, if I'm not mistaken, several days ago when Russian commandment claimed that there were such laboratories detected in Ukraine, and also that there were documents, not only traces, but there were documents of that certain pathogens were destroyed upon the recommendation of the American counterpart of those Ukrainian laboratories. However, we must say that the information about such cooperation that it was ongoing, it's been circulating around. It's not such a new development, and in the Russian media there were even documentaries about that. Since around 2005, Russia has been producing one or another kind of information about the issue. But I think with these controversial statements coming from all sides, you see the nature of the biological weapons is controversial itself. It can be easily turned into something dual use, and it's very hard to I believe, define this fine line between where the developments are conducted with a peaceful aims and when it can be turned into a biological weapon. I think it should be given proper consideration under the Convention on Prohibition of Biological Weapons, and Russia's claim deserves to be at least considered, and if it's going to be rejected, so be it, but some consideration should be given to that.
Perfect. Moving to you, Abdenoor, the US and Russia have drawn firm red lines that help explain what's at stake. Russia presented the US with a list of demands, some of which were non-starters for the United States and its allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Putin demanded that NATO stop its eastward expansion and deny membership to Ukraine, and that NATO roll back troop deployment in countries that had joined after 1997. Which would turn back the clock decades on Europe's security and geopolitical alignment. These ultimatums are a Russian attempt not only to secure interest in Ukraine, but essentially relitigate the security architecture in Europe, according to some experts. As expected, the US and NATO rejected those demands. Both the US and Russia know Ukraine is not going to become a NATO member anytime soon. Some preeminent American foreign policy thinkers argues that the end of the Cold War, that NATO never should have moved close to Russia's borders in the first place. But NATO's open door policy says sovereign countries can choose their own security alliances. Given in to Putin's demands would hand the Kremlin veto power over NATO's decision-making, and through it, the continent's security. What's your take on this?
And good afternoon to your guests and also to your viewers, and thank you for having me. Yes, as you stated, actually well stated, on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, it sounds like I would say, an end battle of the Cold War that lasted in 1991, and as if the job wasn't finished by the West, led by the US. And on the other hand, the narrative also of the entire concept and imperatives of the Cold War that the world affairs went through in the post-World War II. However, in this time, it looks like, and as your guest mentioned, and also in your report as well, that the Russian today, they are not happy to see the extension and to some extent the expansions of the former Soviet republics to join the NATO, and so that the threat will be imminent to Russia. Now, the post-Cold War narrative and all the international system that went through in the last 3 years, and as we all know, and the experts also have been noticing, there were some major events that shaped the entire geopolitics landscape. I mean, beginning with the new non-state actors and the 9/11 and the war in Iraq, and later on what is happening in the so-called Arab Springs, and to the proxy war that is taking place in Russia and so on. So it sounds like today the Russians, what they're asking is just let's limit our expectations in terms of not get into a hot war. And this is that what, on the other hand, on the West side, are looking at it as if it is, as we would say, raison d'etre. Mm-hmm. So by creating these events that are taking place today on the field on Ukraine, but also there were a premise into this war that, I mean, they were taking place in the last decade and so. So this is what, I can, again, take on this for the current events that are shaping not only the bilateral relations between Russia and Ukraine, but it will impact the entire Europe security system. And this is why the Europeans today, I would say, or can argue, are in the panic mood because they weren't expecting this to happen soon and quickly.
Speaking of expecting different scenarios, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said on Friday that his country was at a turning point in its conflict with Russian forces, appearing to be regrouping for a possible advancement on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Let's have a listen.
It's impossible to say how many days we will still need to free our land, but it is possible to say that we will do it, because we strived for that. Because we have reached a strategic turning point, we are already moving towards our goal, towards our victory.
Back to you, Julia. What kind of turning point are we talking about here? A positive or negative one?
First, if I may, just to add to what Mr. Abdunnoor just said before me, I don't think it came only as a surprise to Vladimir Putin's Western counterparts. It came as a surprise, the decision about the special operation that turned into a war was a surprise to some people, to many people within Russia itself, and we've seen it from the reaction from some groups of the population. Coming to your question about the turning point that Vladimir Zelensky talked about, well, it depends for whom we are trying to assess it, or from whose vantage point, from the point of Ukraine or from the point of Russia. Probably, of course, it is a capital of Ukraine, and this battle is decisive. We can say that Russian troops must be preparing at this moment to provide for all the means necessary for capturing the capital. Half of the capital's population already fled. And take over the capital is supposed to have, besides strategic meaning, also a sort of demoralizing effect at Ukraine, which would probably mean a sort of adjournment, or indeed this turning point in the Russian operation in Ukraine. My hope is that with that, well, first and foremost, my hope would be for the military actions to be over as soon as possible. But my next best hope next to it is that as a result of this takeover, the parties can get back to the negotiation table and negotiate a solution, which I presume there will be some compromise found on the security guarantees that Russia is demanding. However, on the part of the Ukrainian side, I guess it also means that Vladimir Zelensky hasn't received enough support from the Western partners as much as he expected to receive. So probably the Ukrainian position on the negotiations will be more compromising. Ukraine might be more willing to compromise, which hopefully eventually would lead to the end of the conflict.
Perfect. Moving to you, Abdunnoor. Now the world is watching and waiting to see what Putin will do next. An invasion isn't a foregone conclusion. Moscow continues to deny that it has any plans to invade, even as it warns of a military technical response to stagnating negotiations. But war, if it happened, could be devastating to Ukraine, with unpredictable fallout for the rest of Europe and the West, which is why, imminent or not, the world is on edge. What do you think?
Indeed, actually, it is already a war. It has been for 7 days. And unfortunately, it looks like it keeps going for the next days, months, I will argue again, if not years. But let's be a little bit, or have a ray of hope and not of optimistic on the issue. It is, there are some progress on the ground from the Russian military, who are making progress, to go and take Kiev. However, there are some slow, because it looks like, coming from the news reports, that there is a serious and resistance coming from the Ukrainians, and I think the Russian side didn't expect that we'll have such an vehement resistance toward this invasion. But Sure, I mean, the government in Ukraine, in Kiev, and President Zelensky, I'm sure he's looking for an exit. This exit comes through negotiations. However, the negotiations or the entire process of these negotiations, it will be decided on the field. I mean, you know the saying, I mean, who owns the field owns the table.
Exactly.
And we saw that on Thursday in the meeting between the two foreign affairs ministers of the respective countries, Ukraine and Russia, in Antalya. I mean, it is just the beginning, but it didn't break through. But it looks like both sides are willing to find, I would say, a possibility to sit and talk. But to end this war, it will be sure some advance from the Russian side, and then will lead to a ceasefire. But there are an optimistic note on this. It looks like also on the field that the resistance or the Ukrainian resistance is determined to continue the fight. It's not going to give up any time or easily. As your guest stated, as far as the West or the support of the West toward Kiev, it looks like the least we can do. I mean, you guys keep resistance. We are here, but we are not going to get involved directly. I mean, but the sadness part indeed is the humanitarian issue. And this is not what Europeans are trying to do, or just, okay, we will have, or we will help you on the humanitarian aid by taking some so-called refugees, and in this case, we will split them by quotas, or depends how this will develop on the field, and then we will spread them in on the European countries, I mean, coming by the neighboring countries, and then extend them so on to Germany and eventually to France. Interestingly enough, I mean, the summit of yesterday, or the European summit that took place yesterday in Versailles, I mean, was just about symbolism, nothing else. Sure, there were some declaration or statement that they will continue or push for the aid, for military aid for the Ukrainians, but just the policy itself, or the meeting where it took place, it's symbolic because of, if you do remember, in 2017, President Macron welcomed or hosted President Putin in Versailles. So that was also about symbolism. So this is what we can say today. And the Europeans are also, as
Very
I
nice.
said,
Very
are
nice.
in panic
Mr.
mode.
Abdanur, let me share with you this piece of news as you're speaking about the escalation. Gunfire were heard in Ukraine's capital amid verified reports that the fighting had already reached the heart of Kiev. Explosions sounded nearby Kiev as Russian troops approached the Ukrainian capital. The explosion has not yet been confirmed to be from Russian or Ukrainian soldiers. Julia, back to you. Are we expecting Kiev to fall in the upcoming hours? If so, what would be the outcome? And why is Kiev so important to Russia? I know that you have already tackled this shortly earlier. I want you to elaborate on this.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I'm not a military expert, and I'm not currently present there on the ground. I can't emphasize it enough to judge about how fast Kiev is going to fall. So we will leave it to our reporters to report to us about that. Indeed, I already mentioned what kind of significance Kiev poses. I wanted to bring into the discussion this kind of debate that is taking place right now. I think the very problematic thing with the whole discussion on the Russia-Ukraine issue is that we have several levels of it. One, and Mr. Abdanur just talked about that, the level of the international system, where there are strategic considerations mostly, and we are not talking about morale and emotions. It's strictly rational. Then there is a level of humanitarian concern, and that's what EU in particular is trying to help with. And then there is also individual level at individual states, at the level of individual citizens, and of course that is fraught with a lot of emotions. So the problem with the discussion that we are currently having is that we keep floating from strategic level towards humanitarian and then this individual emotional and back, and that's why it's very hard to bring arguments relevant to the particular dimension of the discussion. I think if we talk about it at the strategic level, at the level which John Mersheimer, whose lecture of 2015 many are rewatching these days, where he argued that the West, the collective West, is has actually provoked Russia in 2014 for the war that occurred in Donbass. And that lecture was prophetic. Now in 2022, 7 years later, we are exactly having Russia reacting in the same way that John Mersheimer, the proponent of offensive realism, prescribed. The Russian bear, his whiskers has been pulled, and that was the response coming out of strictly strategic considerations, the threat perception that exists in Russia. And that was the reaction, ascertaining Russia's position on those security guarantees that it tried to receive from the West. Some would say that that's a move in order for Russia to move further. It's not just a readiness, it's an expansionist policy, and would say that if we appease the aggressor, which they call Russia now, then it will move further to the heart of Europe. I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that capturing Kiev would have a meaning of retaining control over Ukraine. I think in Moscow, the elites are pretty well aware that there are simply not enough resources, and that's not the goal. The goal is to secure the neutrality of Ukraine as Russia has been demanding.
Yet again, the situation is getting more and more tense. An air raid, the sirens were heard across most Ukrainian cities early on Saturday morning, urging people to seek shelters. Sirens were heard in the capital city of Kiev, the western city of Lviv, in Odessa, in Kharkiv, Cherkasy, as well as in Sumy region in the northeast of the country. A number of local Ukrainian media, or according to a number of local Ukrainian media, as they are reporting, things seem to be intensifying on the ground, and the grip is getting tighter on Ukraine. Why aren't Ukrainians giving up? Is it because of the international support? Although we don't see anything really concrete on the ground, Mr. Abdenour.
Sure. I mean, I think it's symbolic. I mean, if Kiev will be taken by the Russian troops, it's a very, I would say it's a victory for all, so my victory for the Russians, but also it is one of the ultimate goals. And then, as we stated earlier, when we were hoping for a negotiation process, and this will put a pressure on the Ukrainian side and let the Russians go, I would say, as I said, I mean, they are on in the field, so they can have, say, a large maneuver in terms of negotiations. And as your guest said, because they want to, for neutrality, they want to neutralize Ukraine and put it back from its desire or temptations to join the NATO and eventually the European Union. But on the other hand, the West sounds like are clear. I said they are in a panic mode because for their own interests, their national interests, because they know, I mean, President Putin still has a solid card in his hands, and he's using it, actually, the oil/gas card.
Nice.
And the European, I mean, they showed some unity in the first 2-3 days of the war, but later on, they are totally divided on this issue. This is why, again, it's going, in the end, all the short-term meetings and eventually talks, the Russians, they will have this card to pressure further the authorities in Kiev. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians, I mean, they are actually left alone because at the beginning they thought there is one thing is important. It's the Western media and the public opinion who are trying to shape the dynamic of the conflict. But this is if the war on the field will continue. It might change some, I would say, European in some European capitals, but in the general dynamic of the conflict, will let them actually will pressure them to kind of find a middle way and to
Very
find
nice. And all this through negotiations, probably. And following a request from Russia, the Security Council gathered on Friday for an open meeting on Ukraine, citing allegations of military biological activity in the European country. Let's follow this report to have further insight, and we continue our discussion.
The UN Security Council has turned into a field of accusations of misinformation and manipulation between the West and Russia, on the occasion of a meeting requested by Moscow on the alleged presence in Ukraine of biological weapons coordinated with the United States. The Russian permanent representative of the UN, Vasily Nevezhya, said during the meeting that the Ukraine and the US are plotting to use a biological weapons program.
On the territory of Ukraine, there is a network of at least 30 biological laboratories in which very dangerous biological experiments are carried out, aimed at reinforcing the pathogenic qualities of plague, anthrax, tularemia, cholera, and other deadly diseases using synthetic biology.
For her part, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations denied Russia's allegation, claiming that biological laboratories in Ukraine have nothing to do with chemical arms, and accused Russia of using the UN as a platform to spread disinformation.
Russia has a track record of falsely accusing other countries of the very violations that Russia itself is perpetrating. And given that, and consistent with our previous statements, we have serious concerns that Russia may be planning to use chemical or biological agents against the Ukrainian people.
The UN disarmament chief said that the organization is not aware of any biological weapons program in Ukraine.
I am aware of media reports regarding allegations of biological weapons programs. The United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons programs.
A UN spokesperson said there is no information to confirm that Ukraine has biological weapon labs after the Russian Foreign Ministry claimed that it had received documentations from employees at Ukrainian biolabs.
Back to you, Julia. Do you think that the UN is doing enough to stop this crisis, especially at these crucial moments for Ukraine amid such grave allegations?
Well, I think what we are observing here going on now, especially after this yesterday's meeting of the Security Council, is the exhibition of the ongoing criticism towards the United Nations and its structure of the global governance mechanism. I guess Russia had its right to represent the evidence and raise its concerns within the UN Security Council, but also with the atmosphere of distrust existing within this international body itself. Russia probably wouldn't be wrong to remember the pretext for the 2003 invasion to Iraq, remembering the Colin Powell presenting presumably allegedly the proof of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So there is a stone to be thrown into the yard of the other UN Security Council members, and provided the experience that we've had so far within the international system, I think it would be reasonable to at least give consideration and to this claim that Russia makes, and to conduct investigations, at the very least to prove that there are indeed no laboratories of trying to develop biological weapons.
Very well.
And after all, we had another example just now that, for example, with China, claiming that it had its laboratories of strictly peaceful character orientation, and then they were accused by no one but the United States in trying to develop COVID COVID-19 in its laboratories. So I guess it should be checked, and we should rely on facts and results of investigation.
So this could be all a hoax, just a pretext to escalate maybe the situation further, or give oneself the opportunity or let's say, the motive to escalate it further. Mr. Abdenour, are we really aware of what is happening on the ground amid this insane spread of fake news?
I mean, all this war is all about fake news and false reports. But also, it's a part of the psychological war on the ground, and also on the audiences, I mean, across the world. So I want just to add a point about the bioweapons. I think it's just I would say, a pressure card. And then also, speaking of psychology of the war, and also to make more pressure on the civilians, especially in the Ukraine. And as Professor Julia said, when she mentioned the show of Colin Powers in 2003 at the UN, at the Security, at the UN, and then in the rush of the war to Iraq. It is, today, the UN has become irrelevant and is not doing anything, I mean, that could help to, again, find issues and solutions or peace and security the dynamic and imperatives. Because in the end of the day, all these crises will be in the hands of the superpowers. So, and this is why, again, it looks like the Cold War didn't end yet, and we saw these proxy wars that took place in Iraq and later on in Syria, and today in Ukraine. It's an extension of the Cold War by other means.
Yes, and one of the means is European support for Ukraine. The Union is imposing new sanctions against the Kremlin and a plan to end the EU's fossil dependence on Russia by 2017. Mr. Abdenour, you mentioned that Russia may be using this as a card. Let's follow the report and see how far this could go.
After the 2 days European summit, which ended Friday in Versailles, the 27 members of the European family reiterated their support for Ukraine. Massive new sanctions, energy dependence, financial support for Ukrainian forces, and food sovereignty were on the agenda of the summit. The president of the European Commission said that the EU activated the temporary protective directive for the first time in European Union's history, granting Ukrainians residency rights, access to labor market and schools. Ursula also stated that Ukraine's admission to the European Union is in the process, confirming that Ukraine is a family member.
There are conditions to be part of the European Union that have to be met.
As for Europe's dependence on energy and raw materials, Scholz expressed that Europe should free itself from dependence step by step.
We will work together to gradually free ourselves from this dependence by developing alternative resources for our imports of oil, gas and coal.
French President Emmanuel Macron, when asked by a journalist about sanctions, said that nothing is taboo and that they're ready to punish beyond what has been done.
I have the certainty if things continue on the military level, in the straight line of what you have just described, that we will take new sanctions, including massive sanctions.
Macron also noted that food sovereignty in Europe and Africa is threatened, emphasizing that they must prepare and reassess their production strategies.
Back to Julia. $500 million aid for Ukraine, but nothing is changing on the ground. Is Ukraine a victim of European fake promises?
Indeed, that's a big allocation, but we do not expect this to change things on the ground immediately. Resources are needed to provide to address the refugee crisis, which has not been going on very well, to put it mildly, to provide for the food security, and from what I understand, the international concern is not only about Ukraine, which is a center of attention now, but also about the rest of the world. In particular, some of the states in the Middle East rang the alarm bell about the upcoming wheat supply, which is not going to come from Russia and Ukraine, which are the main suppliers of that. There's indeed a lot of misinformation circulating on all the sides, and as I said before, probably the Ukraine government overrelied on the promises on the part of the EU and other partners to support, but obviously they are not willing to engage to this on the ground, and are even carefully considering what would be a casus belli, a reason for them to become a party to this war when they are thinking about supplying or not supplying weapons, which are, I think whatever has been supplied, mostly has been supplied since 2014, but not in the course of the ongoing conflict. So.
Very nice, very nice. Abdenour, what can the world do better to meet the expectations of the Ukrainian people and government?
I mean, if you mean the global
community, yeah.
Yeah. So I would argue, I mean, that again, the European Union, because they are the direct actors who are concerned about this war, and I think what they are going to do, I mean, they're trying just now to open or to play the humanitarian card, and by letting some, I mean, they already passed, according to the UNHCR and ECHO reports, that they passed the 2 million refugees who crossed to neighboring countries, and there are other European countries, Western European countries, who are taking the refugees in there or hosting them. But I think that what they're doing is just the least we can do, and this is started from the beginning. And we saw even President Macron himself, as the current president of the European Union, he tried in the pre-invasion to play the role of the mediator between President Zelensky and President Putin. It didn't go well. And then we saw during the war or the crisis, there are news reports that they spoke on the phone for 14 times. And this is a lot.
So diplomatic efforts is not really working, and the sanctions are not changing Putin's mind, obviously. And in another blow, speaking of sanctions, US President Joe Biden announced new sanctions against Russia on Friday, downgrading trade ties with Moscow and banning the key Russian imports come amid a raft of new economic sanctions the Biden administration is imposing on Moscow. Let's follow these reports for more insights.
Few days after the United States announced it will no longer receive Russian oil, US President Joe Biden announced from the White House that his administration issued an executive order blocking US import of key Russian products.
We're also taking a further step of banning imports of goods from several signature sectors of the Russian economy, including seafoods, vodka, and diamonds. And we're going to continue to squeeze Putin. The G7 will seek to deny Russia the ability to borrow from leading multinational institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
The action will block more than $1 billion in Russian revenues, and according to the White House, the fresh export restrictions are valued at nearly $550 million per year. Biden said the decision was taken in coordination with NATO allies, the European Union, and the G7.
Later today, together with other NATO allies in the G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, as well as the European Union, we're going to jointly announce several new steps to squeeze Putin and hold him even more accountable for his aggression against Ukraine.
US President added the G7 is imposing further sanctions to more Russian oligarchs, and the US will move to revoke most favored nation trade status for Russia.
The G7 is also stepping up pressure on corrupt Russian billionaires. We're adding new names to the list of oligarchs and their families that we're targeting. And we're increasing coordination among the G7 countries to target and capture their ill-begotten gains.
Canada is also imposing new sanctions on dozens of military entities in Russia and 5 individuals close to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, including Roman Abramovich. The individuals targeted will have their assets frozen and will no longer be able to profit or benefit from business dealings in Canada.
Back to you, Julia. More sanctions from the world, and Russia isn't nudging. Apparently, Russia has an alternative, as our guest Abdunnoor said, and Putin is promising Russia shall rise victorious. Julia, what can we get from this?
Well, I don't think the leader of the state that is waging such a campaign in order to ostensibly secure its national interest would say otherwise. Of course, he would say that Russia would rise victorious. It also reflects on the morale of the Russian military and Russian people, where actually the information campaign to justify what's happening in Ukraine also has been fairly successful.
So it's just political talk. Abdunnoor, Russia seems to have an important card, you said, which is energy. Could it be a launching energy war? Do you think it's going to use this card anytime soon?
I think it will if the Europeans keep pushing and to some extent provoking President Putin. But in the end of the day, they know that they cannot go that far because, again, President Putin has other options and he has many, many alternatives. And he knows also that especially Europe is just, we are about days to move on from the, if I may say that, post-COVID-19 and all the consequences and the impact that the COVID caused to the European economies. So I don't think they can keep, going far to pressure President Putin. And President Putin knows this well. But it's an important point here. It's the fight. It's not with the European. he knows well. President Putin from day one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdunnoor. Sorry to cut you out there. We are running out of time. We met the deadline. We're coming to a close. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much, Abdunnoor. The discussion was really rich, and thank you for these interesting insights. Ladies and gentlemen, our special coverage continues day by day. Next up, we have our English news bulletin coming to you live from All 24 News. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.